ready, but then comes through and they have to sell it.
Did I give him my card?
No, I didn't. So if I get in trouble.
Yeah. I mean, November. He's
Yeah, so I think I'm going to have to sell November 1st. I'll have to come down here and get there November 1st.
What I want to do is just give a definition of threat and look at that from a perspective of the threat against elephants. Now, a threat is an intention to inflict pain, injury, damage, or other hostile action resulting in the restraint of freedom of action. And the threats against Africa's wildlife and natural resources come in many forms. These must be identified and analysed so that what constitutes each threat at a specific time, place, and situation is understood. Only then can a range of relevant, bespoke, and coordinated deterrents be deployed in order to meet the challenges that the threats pose with a view to neutralising them. If this is not done, the threats will evolve into a wider reality. In the case of the African elephant, it will be its extinction. And I think this is one of the very first elements that definitely my organisation are looking at is as we live on the ground, we're involved in those threats every day, both locally, nationally, and internationally. And from my background, when you're looking at combating a threat, the very first thing you've got to do is understand it and what constitutes that threat. Now, Africa is a large continent, as we know, 56 recognized and de facto states, if you include Somaliland. Each one of these states has different governments, different laws, different perceptions, different expectations, different people, and different wildlife. So what I'm trying to say is that one hat doesn't fit all, and it's an incredible task to try and look at something that can address the challenges across a wide variety of different countries. Much has been reported in the world's press online about the increase in the armed poaching gangs across Africa, killing elephants for their ivory and rhino for their horns. But like all armed conflicts, each geographical poaching hotspot has its own unique footprint, and each area for there needs to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. This slide is courtesy of CITES and Save the Elephants in Kenya, and what it shows there is that in 2012, the CITES Commission project for the monitoring of illegally killed elephants, who I'm sure some of you know about, a project called MIKE, identified significant increases in levels of elephants illegally killed for ivory in all 4 regions of Africa. The levels identified in the red and the orange are non-sustainable. They cannot be sustained. And the story behind this analysis goes a lot further than just the science, and indeed the elephants. It affects millions of Africans and the capacity to affect many other people further afield. If we can actually look very briefly, this is actually the 2011 to 2012 data. And as you can see, some of the populations in red, high risk. And what it basically is saying is that of all the elephants that have been found dead in these areas, in red, 80 to 100% have been killed illegally, so poached. Orange, 60 to 80%, and green, 0 to 20%. So Southern Africa, up until now, has not had the impact on elephant poaching. We know there's been a lot of rhino poaching in Southern Africa, but the elephant poaching, up until now, luckily, has not really been at the same levels as in East and Central Africa. Although yesterday, I think I had reports in Kruger, on the Mozambique side of Kruger, elephants had just started being hit quite severely. So maybe that's unfortunately something that's just coming. But 3 years previously to this, pretty much everything was green. So it's been a rather quick increase across Central and Eastern Africa. So, I mean, I don't think I have to go on to the fact that it is the illegal ivory trade that is responsible for this rapid decline in elephant populations. The situation in itself has been described as an emergency and a crisis. In those African countries lucky enough to still have elephant populations, law enforcement is the only way to protect the remaining populations on the ground. The important question there should therefore be, what is required operationally to secure the remaining populations of elephants in Africa, and do the host nations have the capacity in relation to the threats they face to do this? Quite a controversial question, but I think we're at the point now that we have to start asking those sort of questions. Like many other illegal commodities traded worldwide, ivory and rhino horn are being exploited to fund transnational criminal networks and syndicates. What is less well documented is that the situation on the ground has indicated that the illegal ivory trade has been and is currently funding extremist and terror organizations in Africa, creating a direct threat to the United States and its African allies. Historically, the trade in ivory has operated in parallel with such activities of the slave trade, lately the illegal arms trade, the drugs trade. However, it now appears to be developing a new and even more sinister dimension. The ivory trade has always provided an easily obtained form of untraceable revenue for those who require it. With the emergence of Islamic fundamentalism in East Africa, why then should terrorists be any exception? Especially when this natural resource is readily available in their immediate geographical area. Global instability is taking today on many new forms and is constantly evolving new and different lines. However, the use of natural resources to finance armed conflict is nothing new. We've had gemstones, gold, coltan, oil, all funded conflicts in the past. And in Afghanistan, we've had opium has been a source of revenue for the Taliban. In East Africa, we're increasingly seeing the elephants are in the gun sights of Somali and local organized criminal gangs. The market for ivory is at an unprecedented level, as is the poaching of Kenya's elephants. Again, I'm going to start talking specifically about Kenya, if you forgive me for that, but that's my area of operations. Well, I have operated in Tanzania for 10 years as well, but it's be specifically that area. And as I say, the different elements, different parts of Africa will have different elements to the threat. And of course, different ways of challenging that threat. But with a combined population of 2.25 billion people and an increasingly affluent middle class, the two main ivory consumer states, China and Vietnam, create a demand that will outstrip supply within our lifetime. I mean, probably within the next 7 to 10 years at the current rates. One of the main questions we have to ask, I think, is what does that huge demand fund? What does the money do? And they were talking in billions of dollars. There has been little effective investigation to obtain evidence relating to groups such as Al-Shabaab and their use of illegal ivory and other natural resources to fund their operations. However, wildlife managers with security experience who are operating on the ground have seen an evolution of activity that, combined with specific indicators, represents a credible and increasing threat that Al-Shabaab in East Africa is gaining financial support through trading illegal ivory. Just some background on Al-Shabaab for those who are not up to date. Al-Shabaab emerged as the radical youth wing of Somalia's now defunct Union of Islamic Courts in 2006. They have imposed a strict version of the Sharia law in the areas under their control. This includes things like stoning women to death, accused of adultery, and amputating hands and arms of people accused of thieving. They act in much the same way as the Taliban did in Afghanistan. Al-Shabaab means youth in Arabic, as Taliban means student in Pashto. The names are just one part of the comparisons between the two organizations. It is no coincidence that such extreme organizations are using ivory, and they follow a repeated pattern when it comes to funding of their operations locally. Ivory has been found in former Al-Shabaab strongholds in Somalia that have been overrun by Kenyan and African Union forces. And we've known that ivory has long been used by the Janjaweed and the Lord's Resistance Army in other parts of Africa. This source of finance will always be available to Al-Shabaab and other Islamic terrorist organizations in East Africa, as long as the terrorist organizations are using such a resource and that the security and anti-poaching deterrent on the ground is not sufficient to deny them access to it. Ivory is a source of revenue too convenient for al-Shabaab to ignore, and it would be naive to think otherwise. Many members of al-Shabaab have poached elephants for ivory and claimed ivory taxes from commercial poaching gangs involved in the illegal trade for many years. In fact, this chap here, we shot dead in Tsavo. He was part of a gang that killed 10 elephants together, and an operation that we did a follow-up on. He was shot dead by the waterhole. He had a book on him, and you know, the Somali culture is an oral culture, and you don't usually find these guys writing things down. He had a book on him with lists of telephone numbers, who are probably hawaladars, the hawala banking facilitators, and various breakdowns of money that had been used for him to facilitate his poaching in the area. He had 110 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition and 2 rifle launch grenades on him. And that was 10 years ago, by the way. That wasn't just now. So this isn't something it's gradually evolved, but only in the last 4 years has it rapidly evolved. A joint message from Al-Qaeda's head Ayman al-Zawahiri and al-Shabaab leader Ahmed Abdi Ghodani was posted on the internet in February 2012, declaring the Somali fundamentalist organization formerly a part of the Al-Qaeda terror network. The military interventions of Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia have now denied al-Shabaab access to their lucrative funding sources. The result is al-Shabaab is desperately seeking new funding across their regional areas of operation. We've seen an example of this. There was a charity set up, a Somali charity, following the death of Osama bin Laden, called the Martyr bin Laden Charity Campaign, supposedly raising money for Somali refugees. In fact, it was raising money for operations in Kenya. Unfortunately, they were only able to raise approximately $17,000. And ivory represents a far more lucrative source of revenue, whose value on the streets of Beijing has increased 1,500% since 2008. So it's a matter of economics, really. Al-Shabaab is not a centralized or monolithic in its agenda or goals. Its rank and file members come from various clans, even varying nationalities, and it's susceptible to clan politics, internal divisions, and shifting alliances. Historically, most of its Somali fighters have predominantly been interested in the nationalistic battle against the federal government of Somalia and have not been supportive of the wider global jihad. However, the continuing influx of foreign fighters from Iran, Middle East, Pakistan, Europe, Australia, and the US has created a dangerous split in the organization, and we are now seeing the emergence of a new al-Shabaab, a global jihadist movement dedicated to creating a Taliban-style Sharia state in East Africa. The Al-Khatib Foundation, al-Shabaab's media center, recently released a series of videos on the internet urging foreign jihadists from all over the world to come and join and fight in Somalia. Just to bring a few individuals, that Shawa Ahmed was the first known American suicide bomber, and he died while initiating an attack in Bosaso in Puntland, Horn of Africa, for al-Shabaab. A prominent member of al-Shabaab, believed to be heading a separate jihadist splinter group targeting Kenya, is Omar Shafiq Hamami, otherwise known as Abu Mansour Amriki, an American citizen from Daphne, Alabama, with Irish-American roots, who was reportedly brought up as a Southern Baptist. So these are, the net is being spread very wide, and we're seeing indicators on the ground with an increase of the instances of poaching and the instances of the numbers of ivory that is being confiscated in the ports of Nairobi. Now, one of the things, if we're seeing increases in the confiscations, it means that's probably only about 5 to 10% of what's being shipped out. So the monetary worth of what's leaving Kenya from the ivory markets could be, quite significant. The development of these networks, the training and nurturing of foreign fighters in East Africa, and the launching of attacks costs money, and al-Shabaab have to find this from within the local region. Ivory is readily available locally, an untraceable income source that has been used by Somalis and Arab traders along the East African coast for centuries. So it's nothing new. All the mechanisms are there. It's just that things have changed dramatically in the last at least 4 years anyway. There are over 100,000 Somalis living in the United States, the great majority of whom are law-abiding people with the sole purpose of securing a better life for themselves and their families. In fact, one of them drove me here in a taxi today. It's quite interesting, I know. I knew his clan, even. However, those who do not have to live with war on a daily basis, but feel they need to support Islamic terrorism, making them susceptible to radicalization in a distant environment, are the threat in this country. Some such individuals have been identified in the US. There have been arrests, indictments, convictions of a number of Somalis providing material support for al-Shabaab. These cases provide further evidence of the significance of Hawala in terrorist financing and emphasize its dominant role with the Somali diaspora community for sending remittances back to Somalia and the potential for its abuse to fund al-Shabaab and support its activities. I just want to say one thing, that Hawala has actually been an incredible process for good in many ways. It's the oldest, I don't know if anybody, for those who don't know, it's the oldest banking system in the world. It's been going since the 7th century. It's been responsible for the financial security of a lot of countries that have been subjected to civil unrest and disorder. But it has been abused by fundamentalist organizations, and it cannot be traced. But it's something that's used where I'm from regularly every day, and it's a lot cheaper than Western Union. So it's a relevance to what is happening with the illegal ivory trade. For the international terrorists that use it and those that live and operate within the conservation areas of Africa, the world is becoming a smaller place. They can launch an attack that has been planned and funded in a remote African location, even in the wilderness, to hit almost any target in the world. As we know, that's happened before. The estimated cost of implementing the terrorist attack on the 2 US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in 1998 amounted to approximately $50,000. That was the cost of the terrorists themselves. The current wholesale price of ivory on the international market has risen from approximately $157 per kilo in 2008 to $2,357 a kilo in 2012, meaning that 22 kilos of ivory now equates to $51,854. And taking an average ivory tusk weight of about 30 pounds, that means only 1.6 tusks would be required to fund a spectacular double attack on 2 US embassies in East Africa. 1.6 tusks really equates to one middle-aged elephant being poached, which could equate to the deaths of 233 people and the wounding of 4,000. That's the power of ivory now in these remote locations. So the crucial question is what needs to be answered after going on that rather long situational analysis. Are we doing enough to deny international Islamic terrorist organizations access to a readily available, untraceable form of revenue from the illegal ivory trade? And is there an answer? Well, I think we do have an answer. And the answer comes from the people of Africa themselves. Al-Qaeda and al-Shabaab approach to attacking democratic countries is based on the idea of fear and the control of that idea. This fear was initially sown through what is known as, in anti-terrorism or counter-terrorism terms, as spectacular attacks, such as those in New York, Bali, Madrid, London, and in East Africa. The backlash against al-Qaeda in response to these attacks was, however, so great that it almost destroyed them. It appears that al-Shabaab is looking at a very different long-term approach in Kenya, and we are seeing an attempt to gradually occupy identified rural areas where they can operate from and expand into wider communities and influence them. The geographical location of these areas they are trying to infiltrate is convenient to the insurgents, as many are also elephant habitats. And so there is a ready form of income available through the ivory. As in all such situations, it is the people who are the real prize for the terrorists and for extremists. Their aim is to influence and control communities through fear. The outcome could have significant impact on internal security wider international interests, and the survival of wildlife, which through tourism is a key economic asset for Kenyans. In the case of the ivory crisis, it is the rural African communities who will lose most from the ongoing ivory poaching situation and the threat from Islamic insurgents. With appropriate support, they are also the only ones who can bring about a positive solution, and they've asked for that support. Now, in rural areas where people have developed community wildlife conservancies, particularly in Kenya and northern Kenya through the Northern Rangelands Trust, which is a mosaic of, I think, 19 conservancies now, and 23 waiting. These are communities banging on the door wanting to start conservancies. Through that facilitation, we've seen wildlife protected and also an increase in the economic stability of the wider area. It is the conservancy security apparatus that communities are turning to for support and protection against extremist Islam. In many remote areas, it is only the community wildlife conservancies that offer a meaningful form of security infrastructure and of local law enforcement services and local security for people. In today's world, international security and the survival of the world's largest land mammal, the African elephant, are intrinsically linked. But are we providing a deterrent to the elephant poaching in Africa? The current challenges posed by the escalating poaching threat have evolved over a relatively short time, leaving many African law enforcement agencies and national wildlife authorities with a situation that they are not equipped to tackle. Anti-poaching operations were consistent for many years, and up until recently, most national wildlife authorities and conservation groups have been able to address the relatively low levels of illegal activity. In the last few years, however, the threat has moved from a consistent threat to a dynamic threat. The increase in ivory prices, fueled by demand mainly from China, has created a security situation over and above what was previously faced by wildlife authorities. In essence, anti-poaching has in some areas moved from a simple policing operation to a low-level form of counterinsurgency, increasingly involving some of the world's most notorious and professional crime syndicates and international terrorist organizations. This has resulted in the overstretching of existing resources and a lack of sufficient deterrence on the ground. I believe that no wildlife agency in the world is set up to fight terrorism, insurgents, and rebel armies. But that is what is expected of the Kenya Wildlife Service, of the ICCN in the Congo, the wildlife authorities in Chad, to name but a few. The Kenya Wildlife Service in Tsavo are facing increasing threats from insurgents from Somalia using not only automatic weapons, but as I've said, rifle-launched grenades and other sophisticated weaponry. Many of these insurgents are trained Islamic fundamentalists working in cells. They are attempting to influence and recruit rural Kenya communities with a long-term strategy, and they are using ivory to fund much of their operations. I'd just like to say that this is not mission creep. It's an escalation of the threat. The only thing in the short term that will halt the slaughter of elephants in Africa is a suitable deterrent. This deterrent must come in the form of a multi-dimensional approach using international support and expertise coupled with African knowledge and implementation. I've waffled for long enough. Does anybody have any questions now?
Can you be more specific about what you just said?
A multi-dimensional approach. Yes. I'm going to move over onto the sort of Tsavo approach and the Tsavo Trust approach about using what we term as stabilization through conservation. And our philosophy is that you really can't attempt to conserve wildlife in an area unless it's stable, economically and from a security and law enforcement perspective. Quite basically, if you want to serve this much wildlife, you've got to manage this much area and all the elements of that area. And that's one of the reasons I'm sitting here today, and one of the reasons that we launched the Tsavo Trust is in my area, so I say my area, where I live and I have land in Tsavo, and my family, we've been there for 4 generations. And we know we're part of the local fabric. And two of the communities, the Wakamba community in our area and the Oroma community, which is north of us, approached us independently and said, you know, we need some help to do this. You know, we've known each other many years. What can we work on together to do this? So I put this idea together, and I sat there for many hours under trees and talked to the elders and the chiefs, and they're really supportive of it. So it's not as if we're asking people to buy in, they're asking us to work together. And we're all part of the same community anyway, so it's quite an interesting dynamic. But the Oroma people in the north, I'll show you a map very shortly, they have an amazing area. It's about 1.6 million acres, and it's one of the real last frontiers of East Africa, in so much as there are no roads in the area. There's no infrastructure at all. There's probably about a dozen abodes with a tin roof. That's about as infrastructure you get. Everything else is pastoralism. And the Oroma people they're Cushitic from Ethiopia. They're amazing, actually, very untouched tribe almost. But having dealt with all sorts of different other pastoralist tribes, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, they are the most easiest people to deal with, mainly because we've known each other for so long. But it's a real desire to do something. And the Oroma have been persecuted by the Somalis for many years. I mean, there's been a lot of press about the conflicts between the Pokomo, which is a tribe in the north, and the Oroma, and there's been a lot of problems there. But in the south, which is the Omo country, is bordering the Tsavo National Park. They've been bringing their cattle into the park since before it was a national park. I mean, to put a border up there and just say no more is very difficult. But they're interested in working together, and they want the security, and they want the security that conservation can bring them. And that was a very interesting point that came from them. We want the security that conservation can bring us. And the chief, Omar, is very keen to support. And he, in fact, was the catalyst for doing this. So it's a blank sheet of paper with a very willing human element. And so what we attempted to do will be to stabilize the area, develop conservation in the area, record it, film it, and use it as a blueprint that hopefully can be copied in other areas, relevant areas in Africa. This is the area. There's a few points of interest in here. This is Kenya, and this is the Tsavo area. This is what it looks like, and that's just a small part of it. And there's still a lot of wildlife moving in and out of that area, but it's been hit by poachers considerably, mainly Somalis, but some of the Oroma have been poaching as well. I don't know if you remember, there was 11 elephant shot dead in Kenya recently. That was actually in this area up here. Operations have been very successful on that, been the follow-up, and arrests have been made. Unfortunately, we lost a covert KWS operator who was shot dead in a car in Garissa as he was on his mobile phone. But there have been arrests, and I think 2 of the poachers are now dead. But that was quite a significant operation in many ways. But this area is here, and you can see the movements in and out of Tsavo. This weapon, this AK-47, was found after a contact in the Taita area down here. So you know, it's a counterinsurgency campaign that we're fighting in this area, and it's the sort of lawlessness that the people in Oroma, local people, have been facing for much longer. So there is a sort of mutual threat here, and there is a definite appeal really to work together, to stabilise the areas, push these people out, and then and start getting the wildlife backing and helping to enhance the economic stability as well in these areas. Anybody any questions on this one? Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little more about the economic model there? I mean, it sounds as though some of these people are leading very traditional lifestyles.
Yes.
But if you look in a lot of places around the world, the traditional lifestyles nowadays tend to be unstable. They break down because of the desires of the younger generation for an education, for consumer goods, and so forth. So is there an economic model that would enable this area to transition into something different, and do they even want that?
Yeah, the economic model is a very important element of the next phase after stabilization, when we can get a bit of peace and stability into the area. The Oromo people in the north are pastoralists. They have some amazing cattle, some of the best cattle in the country. The problem is they have to walk them 200 miles to the nearest slaughterhouse. By the time it gets there, they're worth a pittance. And in essence, that's what's kept them. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yeah, so that's one of the elements that we need to address, is the... hello? Hello? Okay. So what we're looking at is that when we're developing the institutional development of an elected management committee for that area, there has to be a livestock officer, a representative livestock officer, and he will have a mentor within the Tsavo Trust, and they will deal with livestock. As livestock is the main element of this traditional community, that's most important to them, and we're going to address that in that way. There's also things that I've been talking to the chief about. He's very interested in starting a tanning industry, leather and tannery. You can't buy leather in Kenya at the moment. The Chinese are buying it like it's going mad. So there's a demand for leather. There's also, I mean, we've got a pastoralist community with large healthy populations of cattle. It'll be a prime area for things like biofuel, just for local consumption instead of charcoal. So you can start using cow dung to produce enough energy for cooking and things like that. So there's these different elements. And then ultimately, I think, in time, then there will be a tourist element into the area as well. But, a lot of people think that it has to be tourism if it's wildlife. And I don't necessarily agree with that because, as you quite rightly pointed out, it's a traditional part of the Oromo way of life. And I'd rather work with that than introduce something new at an early stage. So that would be one of the economic models that we would definitely use. Sorry, yeah.
Explain the arrows on the map.
Oh, sorry. The red arrows are infiltration routes by Somali bandits, and the blue arrows are where the ivory goes out to.
How did you track that?
Well, I mean, I've been fighting these guys for 20 years, so it sort of, we know. I mean, this is one of the things, Somalis are funny guys, they use the same routes. But you need the assets on the ground to do that. And this area, I'll talk about it a bit more, but where the greater area is twice the size of Israel. Israel has got 176,000 men and women to secure its borders. KWS in that area have got 300. So and the Israeli budget is, I think it's $1 billion. The KWS budget is barely enough to pay these guys' salaries. Sometimes they don't get paid. So there's a real element there. But if you develop the conservancies in the outside, you're protecting their perimeter, which means they can then pinpoint and deploy their assets, security assets, more accurately and more economically.
Ian, can you explain what conservancies actually are?
Yes, a conservancy. I mean, there are a lot of different models of conservancy. Probably the most effective conservancies and efficient conservancies in Africa can be found in Namibia and in northern Kenya. And the Tsavo Trust model is very similar to that because it works. Obviously, it's going to be different because there are different cultural elements in different parts of the country. But what it basically is, it's a community-owned area. If the community want to work with wildlife and they want to work with conservation, then they agree to a management plan, which the end result will be that the conservancy will have its own management structure. So one of the main elements of a stewardship organisation like the Tsavo Trust would be to introduce the institutional training so that you have an elected committee of managers. So it's not like community-based conservation where you're building a school and you're doing this and this like that. To me, that's never worked. I've never been an advocate of community-based conservation. It has to be community-led and community-owned. And it has to be from a stable environment. So first, okay, the stabilization element goes in because no one's going to be interested in wildlife with an AK-47 pointed at their head and no food in their belly. And secondly, you're going to have to we look at the institutional management structure that is required. So there's an element there for education and training, and then the wider education of the population. So the population know, very importantly, what they need to expect from the people they've put in place. It's not a tribal system from top down where the guy at the top says whatever. People have to know about accountability. And so there's a lot of that element involved. Sorry.
Talk a little bit more about creating a secure environment from a security perspective. And when you've got an element that's increasingly armed with increased sophistication, who are you arming on the other side of the equation?
Right.
Who's training them? And does that create problems?
Kenya has changed a lot in the last 3 years in so much as security and government. We now have a constitution and we have a very, very respected judiciary, and it's been the judiciary that's kept the peace. What it's also done is that there has been legal frameworks put in place that can facilitate the security of conservancies like this. The Kenya police are now working with communities to develop the Kenya Police Reserve model. So a community like this will produce 60 of their young men and say, we want these men to be trained by the government and become Kenya Police Reserve. And they will be for security of the protected area and conservation and for the wider community. Once they go through the training that the Kenyan government offer them, they are then issued a G3 rifle with ammunition. So that's how that comes. But there are a lot of issues. It's not as simple as that because the training that the Kenyan government give them is limited. So what we do as a stewardship organisation, we take that area and look at it as in the form of what they used to call a tactical area of responsibility, and we look at the situation strategically, operationally, and tactically, and develop a plan that relates to that. So what hasn't been done in the past is when you're looking, particularly in these areas, not all areas, particularly in these areas, where you've got a sort of pseudo counterinsurgency operation, instead of just having your assets wandering around, it has to be intelligence-led. So one of the first things is to develop the intelligence and information function and operation in that area. And that can be done by various ways, but the basic is to develop an information bank from which you can operate from. And it's from that information, like any counterinsurgency operation or any operation where you're trying to secure a border or any operation as such, is that you need a product. So the information comes in to the information operation, it's then processed, and at the end of it you have an intelligence product which is then graded. So if you have information that comes in, it's recorded, it's cross-referenced by using something like the I2 computer system or something with the analyst notebook. Once it's processed, it goes in and it gets graded. If a certain piece of information has had 3 or 5 hits, then it gets a higher grade. And the higher grade information is what is operated on. Because if you don't have that and you start working on any information goes in, you're throwing assets out on the ground, which is not a good way of doing it operationally or economically. And of course, money is the bottom line all the time. So if you've got grade 1 and 2 information relating to a certain incident or a certain potential incident, then you know that you can put your economic assets and operational assets into that area, and there's a high chance that you're going to get a result. If you don't do that, you're walking around in the fog. So that has to be the building blocks, really, of any internal security anti-poaching operation. What's happened so far is that conservation has been the realm of academics, scientists, and enthusiasts. What we're dealing with here is a security situation. So what we have to do now is look at it from a security perspective. The scientists have done their job, done it very well. We've seen across Africa that they've shown data, and it's been analysed statistically, and it's been put out and made public that there is a threat to elephants, and this is the threat of illegally killed elephants across Africa. They've done their job. The enthusiasts have gone out, they've raised awareness, people are doing sponsored walks, people are doing all sorts of stuff to raise the awareness of the situation. But on the ground, what we're going to have to look at now is a professional security operation. It has to be done. It has to be terrorist-led. There has to be training to task. There has to be a heavy community element involved, and there has to be within the laws and regulations of the country, national laws and regulations, to support that. What I've done is recommendations for operational planning criteria. If there was, when providing assistance in situations like this, it would be advised to firstly engage with African wildlife security professionals, both within government and outside the government, because there is a pool of experience there that's in country at the moment, and most of it is not utilised. Engage with your relevant national security wildlife agencies, of course, for the legal element. Engage with community wildlife initiatives that we've spoken about. And then to identify the importance of hotspots. Each area will have its hotspots. In Kenya, we have the Mara, we have Tsavo, we have the northern area. So there are 3 identified hotspots. And then conducting situational analysis after those hotspots have been identified. And situational analysis is not something you do once and then go away. I mean, it has to be continuous. So you have a continuous, what we used to call in picture, all the time, so you know what you're working with. And this is about professionalizing the wildlife management and the wildlife security field. And it's not happening because at the moment in these ways. There's a lot of good people out there and a lot of very professionals, a hell of a lot of knowledge, particularly on the field, but it's not being used to its ultimate capacity. Again, this is for, recommendations for implementation in community wildlife conservancies. The community wildlife services, community wildlife conservancies have a real chance to impact on the conservation, particularly in Kenya and Namibia, the countries that are influencing it, because the wildlife services, they're like any government, their government or entity or organisation, they're constricted by the civil service regulations. They're restricted on where they can recruit from. They're restricted on budgets. They're restricted on elements of the civil service laws and regulations. So it's very difficult, actually, for these guys to actually deploy effectively on the ground. With the conservancies, you don't have that, because they're not, they're still working within a legal framework, but they don't have the civil service constraints wrapped around them. So, for instance, Kenya Wildlife Service has a challenge which they've addressed, and they're very open to talk about. It's the fact that they've had to recruit rangers under the civil service regulations to have a minimum educational standard, and what that has done, it means they've had to recruit people with no bush experience. In the words of KWS, we've had to recruit a bunch of townies to work in the field, and they don't want to do it. And they've nicknamed them their .com generation. And it's something they're addressing. And because, we've got young guys that are going through training, they look very smart in the uniforms, but you get them out there in the bush. As a 40-year-old, 45-year-old man, I'm walking a 20-year-old into the ground because he's only walked on concrete. And he's never carried any weight on his back. He's never walked with cattle and goats since he was 5. He doesn't know how to read the signs on the ground. He doesn't know how to sleep under a tree. He carries his phone with him all the time, all over the place. It goes off in an ambush, and then 3 guys get killed. All these sort of elements. But it's very difficult for a government service to try and regulate that because they're working under this structure. With a community wildlife conservancy, everything's agreed. Your doctrine is already written, so nobody carries mobile phones in the field. You're training and recruiting and training young men that from that big have been surviving in harsh environments with nothing on their feet. They know they could read this carpet if you walked over it, they're tracking. So they're the skills that you need. And they're the skills that we're taking and generating into a credible and accountable anti-poaching and security force. What I'm trying to say is one of the old military doctrines is it's the basics done well. Everyone's talking about special forces, everyone's talking about UAVs and drones and all this sort of stuff. It's the basics done well. Anyone I tell you who's been involved with special operations, special forces are the basics doing it well. You just do the basics better than anybody else. That's what it is. And just a little point on that. Again, a lot of talk about drones, a lot of talk about sophisticated equipment as the silver bullet to stop poaching in these areas. The only way you're going to do it is if you actually deploy operationally on the ground with an intelligence-based perspective and with men that are trained to a certain level. Everything else is in support of that. Sorry, yeah.
So what do you need to replicate this in other areas and other countries?
We haven't done it here yet. This is the plan. I've been working on this for 25 years in different areas in Tanzania and Kenya, and even on counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan, and we've built this model up now. And this is what we're attempting to implement. We've got the buy-in from all the communities. Well, they asked us to do it. What we need to do now is implement this in this massive area of Kenya.
To do that, what, money?
To do this, to stabilize and secure an area that size, 1.6 million acres, would cost in the region of $15 million over 5 years. That's what we're looking at. But what it would do, apart from the wildlife that would be secured, it in that 5 years, this area could be fully fundamentalist. So you might spend $15 million now, but you might have to spend $100 million, lots of equipment and body bags later, being proactive rather than reactive. Done.
Can I go back to the chart where you had the red and the green, and why is it that, for instance, in your area it was red, and the early and down in like areas like Chobe where there are a whole lot of elephants, it was
the map. Yeah.
One of the earlier charts is because you're closer to a port where you can get it out. Or?
Well, basically these areas are more stable than these.
Okay. So it's,
In essence, is what it is. You've got better law enforcement, you've got better economy, but once these areas get taken out, they'll be here because of the money.
You focus extensively on kind of cutting off the supply through the intelligence, through park rangers and whatnot. You also talk about the networks, but I mean, to pragmatically address the problem, we also need to look at demand. I mean, when Ivory's the price of gold and rhino horns are street market value of cocaine, I mean, there is an incentive to
Oh, absolutely.
this. I mean, there's been attempts through PR campaigns, through scientific research to kind of quell the demand. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it has to be a parallel approach. But my biggest concern on that is that, China, 2,500 years of culture, historically, 30 years if you listen to communists, but it's 2,500 years where Ivory has played a part in their culture. How long is it going to get to change that element of their culture, and what is it going to take? So I think we have to buy time on the ground before we get to that point. I personally think that it's very important, it should continue, but I personally think it could be a generational thing before China decides that it doesn't want to use ivory anymore. The Chinese government, I mean, the largest ivory carving factory in the world is owned by the Chinese government. And people were surprised there was no commitment from the Chinese government to CITES. No surprise at all, really. So that's a very tough nut to crack. And we have to hold the fort. We have to protect what we have while concurrently operating on that front as well. I have another organization, the African Environmental Film Foundation. We've just finished a film. We make environmental educational films in African languages, and we distribute to about 250 million people over 46 countries in Africa. But we've just finished a film now on the ivory trade, and they're called White Gold, and it was shown at CITES. It's now being recut, and we're having a Mandarin Chinese version done, and we're in the process of securing some major cinemas in Beijing, Shanghai, Singapore, and Hong Kong for showings of that film in the relevant languages. That's just one element of what we're doing on that one. The US version will be out in, I think, 2 to 3 months, and Hillary Clinton's agreed to do the voiceover for it, the narration for it. But I think the educational part is very, very important. But what we're dealing with from a Tsavo Trust perspective is to secure the resources on the ground while the long-term effects, the long-term strategy is being implemented. And hopefully it won't be generational, but I have a feeling that it might be. Yes?
Earlier in your talk, you mentioned that there was something like 7 to 10 years worth of ivory left to satisfy demand. And now you're saying that your plan to stabilize this one area would take about 5 years. Is that too little, too late?
It's what we've got, I'm afraid. Yeah, I think that you're right. It's this is one area. I mean, there's a lot of other people doing a lot of other things in a lot of other areas. But the 7 to 10 year thing, that was in Kenya, the current rates. There has been a drop. I don't know, because we've had a change of government. I don't want to go any further on that one. But it is something that has to be taken into consideration. And the sort of 7 to 10 year element was something that was brought up, I think, about a year ago. With we were taking information from around Kenya, and at that rate, that's how it was. It's important, but the end of the day is if we can secure this now, we can extend that. We can extend that 7 to 10 years. Hopefully, we can extend it exponentially until we can provide a better political situation from either side, and that's really the strategy.
That point in the new government, because I'm looking at it over here. I mean, we care about terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the first thing we're gonna, and then probably the next, and it may be, this is arguable, but the next thing that Americans care about is, oh, save the animals kind of thing. And so what role will the new government play in these things? I mean, obviously terrorism point everybody, but I mean, is the new government gonna help or hinder or?
Well, that's a question we'd all like to know the answer to. But I mean, already there's talk of new legislation already. I'm not going to start dancing and clapping, but because we know things are. But I've already been approached by members of the new government to see if I would go and meet and talk on various issues. So hopefully that will be a good thing. But Kenya's moved a long way. We now have this National Association of Conservancies, which is very strong in supporting this sort of approach. Kenya Wildlife Service supports it. So things are moving, and Kenya's moved a long way, as I say, and the people of Kenya are now democratically finding they've got a bit of power. And it's going to take a long time. As I say, we're only 50 years old. It's going to take a long time, but Kenya's got a lot of bad press. Some of it deserves, some of it doesn't, quite frankly. And the judiciary is what we're pinning our hopes on. I mean, it was the power of the judiciary in Kenya, really, that stopped any post-election violence, because people trust it. And we've got a good group of people in our judiciary now, and it's being pushed. So I'm optimistic. One has to be optimistic sometimes. But yeah, I think there will be a progression, and of course, Facebook and all these sort of things have also helped bring more Kenyans on board. Kenyans love Facebook. I mean, it's an addiction. I mean, it's phones and everything where there's a signal. I mean, they're on it all the time, and that's helped raise awareness. We started a Facebook page 2 years ago called Kenyans for Wildlife. There's 10,000 members. And there's a hit every minute or so. I mean, it gets quite heated, I must admit, but particularly when you've got pastoralists and agriculturists going at each other. But it's better than taking pangas to each other, over land. So, things are changing, and it's interesting. So if we can just secure this and get working with everybody and get it working, I think we've got a future.
Well, the new president could give you 15 million.
I wish you'd talked to him. Sorry.
Are there instances where the governments are actually participating in the poaching? I've heard of stories like where the Ugandan military is actually using aircraft for.
Yeah, you're talking about in Garamba, the helicopter. There was a helicopter in Uganda. It was believed to be from the in Congo actually, but it was believed to be from the Ugandan military. I wasn't there. I don't know. I've read the reports, probably like you have. We've had, SPLA have been involved in poaching. We know that. I've seen that. And the U.S. government supported the SPLA, but then so did a lot of other people. So, it's and you've got members, poaching is carried out by individuals. Are they working on central government orders, or are they doing it out of their own, corrupt practices? I mean, it's a big question, and it's very difficult to prove, but, there's corruptions and corrupt elements in every government in every way, so, probably is. So, just like buying votes and things like that.
So, if you were to get $15 million, describe the situation in 5 years.
In 5 years' time, we'd hope to have a working committee, a management committee with a democratically elected working committee, a effective security element, effective communications element around the area. We'll be identifying new economic enterprises for the community. We'd have the mentor system in place, which will work as a mirror to the committee for the first 5 to 10 years to ensure that the committee members are, working with the support of people with experience in these situations. And the area hopefully will be stabilized enough to deny any access to hostile elements. And the pressure from the national park, which the people of Oromo cattle have been coming, will be alleviated because we've been instigating management processes which would push water further away from the borders and boundaries of the national park, which would then be ready for cattle on a cyclic grazing element, because that's one of the big pressures coming in from this community. We'd have intensive wildlife zones along the border between the community area and the national park. That's the sort of picture of where we want to be if we got the money in 5 years. I mean, already
the rate of poaching would be reduced by what percentage?
Impossible actually to put a percentage
What would
reached
be the
out.
aspiration based on your
Basically, the aspiration would be that we could deny the Somali influence in that area. So Somali poaching in that area hopefully would be reduced by at least 90%. No such thing as complete reduction of poaching and no such thing as absolute security, but it would be a very high percentage because we would be producing a deterrent to them actually coming into the area. We need to put the processes in to make that work to us in the most best advantage. But yeah, we could definitely reduce poaching to that level. And because the price of ivory, there'll be people that would want to risk it, even within the community. I mean, at the end of the day, it's human nature. That's what we're dealing with. But we've got to give the guys a better alternative. It's all about alternative. So that would be the sort of picture that we're trying to get. And I mean, the Tsavo Trust, although the founder members have been operating in the field in Tsavo for almost generations now. The trust has only been going for 6 months, yet we've got all the support of both communities. We have an aircraft that flies the Tsavo area every single day, and we provide aerial reconnaissance flights and reports on a daily basis.
Ian, thanks a lot for this presentation, and I certainly wish you and your plan the best.
Thank you very much indeed.
Move forward, I'm just wondering, harkening back to a couple of questions on the demand side. It seems like you're building quite a good, in addition to this plan for establishing security, you're building a very good collective of domestic constituency in a country that, as you highlighted, is becoming more democratic and starting to So I'm wondering if there's also a basis to be part of your plan to help reach out to the Kenyan government and perhaps the regional governments to start working on pressing for demand side measures on curbing the trade. Because I worry that the escalation that we're seeing, they're going to continue to escalate, and no matter what great plan you have in place, they're going to find a way at high levels. And so I'm wondering if there's an avenue there
Well,
make
that's.
sure the market's going to
I think that's why it's important with the Conservatives that we have the people on board, because African governments are not usually open to suggestions from foreign NGOs and things like that. They tend to keep them at arm's length as much as possible. I can see why in many cases they can be quite aggressive, some of them as well. But if you've got potential voters in large numbers relying on wildlife, then you have influence on that. And Kenya is being split now into counties with governors, and there's been a devolution of power. And so each county will have a conservation committee and a security committee, and members of the Tsavo Trust have been asked to sit on those as Kenyans and members of the community. The beauty of what we're doing is we're not from outside, we're from there for generations. I mean, the chief, Christ, the chief's father took one of our members on his very first elephant hunt in 1942 in that area, and it goes and goes and goes and goes. So there's a whole generational the thing is like growing up in the same neighborhood. We're all part of the same neighborhood. And people know, and one of the important things I was saying earlier is, in other operations, when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've operated in other operations in Africa, they look at you as the foreigner, and, what are we going to do when you go? What's going to be the result? Well, people know from us we can't go anywhere because we all live here. This is our home. So there's a big influence in that. So we get asked and we get put forward by the communities to sit on these local committees and these local, where you can influence as Kenyans. So it's coming from within. The Tsavo Trust is a Kenyan organisation, and every board member is Kenyan. So it's very much that's a strength.
From the U.S. federal government side,
Mm-hmm.
and you see the activities that we fund and that we're involved in on the ground.
Yes.
What is the most efficient use of funds that you've seen and the most inefficient use of funds? Because we obviously see them as a line item in an annual budget.
Right.
We don't necessarily, we see their work plans, we see their justifications, but we never quite see the end result of how it actually functions on the ground.
Right.
And in Africa, I feel like sometimes that picture is lost because of the dynamics of the clans and the different tribes and the different governments you have to deal with. So the crux of my question is, what can we do better, and what can we fund at a higher priority or collapse into a better program, a better system?
Right. I think, in the conservation world, two examples in the conservation world, there's some, and apologies for anyone here, there's some massive big conservation NGOs. Huge, great structures, massive buildings and all these sort of people. And I think that they get a lot of money. And how effective, and what bang for your buck the US taxpayer gets on the ground, I think is something that I would, in a US government position, look at probably harder. Because you see a lot, and one of the instances was for instance this WWF idea of drones and then bringing machines over from Iraq to Africa and all that. I've heard all these things. It's all great, but what we have to look is what is the operational requirement? Is there an operational requirement for 15 Humvees? And if they're there, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the mechanics? Do we have the spares? Are they that proficient with fuel? Is the fuel available? And all these sort of things are not looked at. The use of UAVs or drones. There's been a lot of flag waving about bring drones in, and everyone thinks of a drone as something that flies over Pakistan and sticks a Hellfire missile into somebody. Well, we can't do that in the middle of Africa, and NGOs and people have a UAV is about this big, and it's for surveillance, and it's got a maximum range of about 3 miles that can be released under federal law or whatever it is. So, people have to understand that when we're talking about certain elements of kit, it has to be operationally correct for what we want to do. Now, UAVs could be good, but let's design the operation first. Let's get the information process. Now a UAV is not for, in this context, it is not an aggressive piece of equipment. It's a piece of equipment for collation of information. Fly up and down a matrix and check the pattern of life. So the operator has to understand what is the presence of the norm and the absence of the norm and presence of the abnormal and all that sort of thing of what he's looking at. So what I'm saying is let's get the operation in, and if there's a requirement for that, let's bring them in if they're available. let's not just bring them in and build an operation around it, because when that happens, once that thing breaks, and it'll break because things break, and you don't have a maintenance team behind it all the time to repair it. Once it goes down, and then the whole operation goes down. So that's one of the things that I think is looking at. And also, that's instead of going, we need to talk more to the people on the ground and get feedback for what's going on and and this sort of thing, what is operationally effective. The US and the UK and allies learned a tremendous amount in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was a real steep learning curve, as all of us that were there understand. But let's look at some of those lessons we can identify, and they are applicable to this scenario. And the influence operations is one of them, and that obviously has wider potential benefits for foreign policy, of course. But for instance, in Afghanistan, just after end of 2003, there was an operation put in, paid for by the U.S. government, by the Asia Foundation, through the Asia Foundation, to put 2 former Special Forces operators in 2-man teams in every province in Afghanistan to live with the Afghans, to live in mosques and sleep in mosques and understand and meet everybody and live in the hills and all that sort of thing for a year prior to the elections. So there was a complete flow of information and a picture about that area and who the personalities were, and relationships could be built, because it's all about relationships. And that, I thought, was a very, very, very well implemented operation. I was part of it, and that's how I know about it. but it got the job done, and actually cost very little, because it was a personal approach. And that's what I think we need more here. The real strength that we have in the Tsavo Trust is our personal approach, our relationships. And the fact that if some guy goes into my area in the Wakamba area, and he's not a Wakamba, he's from another tribe, I get to know about it within 10 minutes. And I think what we can do is we can take a lot of the lessons learned from other areas. We can put them into this, and then we can actually present a really good model for stabilization, conservation, and even mitigation of hotspots further down the line. And if there are hotspots, how we can conduct ourselves in other operations. And that's what I think the real meat of what we can do. Sorry if I went on.
Yeah.